Leilani Kahali stood at her kitchen window in Honolulu, watching the morning sun paint Waikiki Beach in shades of gold and amber, her phone still warm in her trembling hand. 3 years. 1,095 days of choosing store-brand coffee over Kona, of mending clothes instead of replacing them, of saying no to every small pleasure so she could say yes to one magnificent dream. The dream wasn't the turquoise waters or swaying palms. Those were already hers. The dream was gathering everyone she loved under one roof, creating the kind of memory that would outlive her, the way her late husband Keone had always wanted. This was supposed to be for us, Keone, for the family we built together. But the message from her son Kalani had arrived like a stone through glass, shattering everything. Mom, change of plans. Pualani thinks it's better if this trip is just for our immediate family. You understand, right? Thanks for everything. 15 words. 15 words to erase 3 years of sacrifice, to reduce a mother to nothing more than an ATM with a heartbeat. The cruelty wasn't in the exclusion. It was in the assumption that she would simply accept it, that she would smile and wave as they boarded a plane she'd paid for, stayed in rooms she'd reserved, ate meals she'd budgeted for. Here's the truth they don't tell you about family betrayal. It doesn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives in casual text messages, in the presumption that your love is infinite but your worth is conditional. Leilani had always been the kind of woman who gave quietly, who celebrated others' victories as her own, who believed that a mother's job was to build ladders for her children to climb. She'd worked double shifts at the Ala Moana shopping center, her feet aching in sensible shoes, her smile never faltering as tourists asked for directions she'd given 1,000 times before. Every dollar she'd saved carried the weight of her body's exhaustion, the memory of meals she'd skipped, the ghost of small dreams she'd deferred. And now, her son, her firstborn, the boy she'd rocked through fevers and coached through heartbreaks, had decided she was unnecessary for the celebration her own money had made possible. But here's what Kalani and his wife Pualani hadn't considered. Leilani Kahal might have been raised to be accommodating, but she'd also been raised on an island where the ocean teaches you about power and patience. Water doesn't argue with stone. It simply persists, and eventually, the stone surrenders. As she set down her phone and opened her laptop, a strange calm settled over her. The kind that comes when you stop trying to convince people of your value and start showing them the cost of dismissing it. They think I'll just take this. They think I'm too old, too tired, too grateful for crumbs to demand the whole table. Let's see how grateful they feel when the table disappears. The reservations were all in her name. The beachfront suite at the Halekulani, the private snorkeling tour, the luau dinner, the rental car, everything carefully planned and prepaid. With 3 clicks, she placed holds on every confirmation. With 3 more, she contacted her credit card company and froze the authorized charges. She didn't cancel anything outright. That would have been too obvious, too confrontational. Instead, she simply created a situation where their dream vacation would require her active participation to proceed. And she had no intention of participating. Leilani understood something profound in that moment. Silence, wielded correctly, is the loudest statement you can make. The philosophy is ancient, but often forgotten. Respect cannot be demanded, but its absence can be demonstrated. When someone shows you that your presence is negotiable, your response shouldn't be to argue your importance. Your response should be to remove the very foundation they've taken for granted. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about reclamation, reclaiming her dignity, reclaiming her resources, reclaiming the narrative of her own life from people who'd rewritten her as a supporting character in their story. As the sun climbed higher over Diamond Head, Leilani began making a different kind of list, one that had nothing to do with Kalani and Pualani, and everything to do with women like herself, women who'd been set aside, overlooked, reduced to their utility, rather than celebrated for their humanity. The planning had begun on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 3 years and 2 months before the betrayal, when Leilani had found Keone's old journal tucked behind their wedding photo album. His handwriting, always careful and deliberate, had spelled out a single regret. "I wish I'd taken everyone to Maui before my legs got so bad. Families scattered across islands shouldn't have to wait for funerals to gather." He'd passed 4 months later, his wish unspoken but now discovered, and Leilani had decided she would fulfill it for him. Not Maui, they were already on Oahu, but the Big Island, with its volcanoes and black sand beaches, places Keone had described from his childhood. She would gather their children, grandchildren, cousins, everyone, and create the reunion her husband had dreamed of. She'd started small, picking up extra hours at the shopping center, working the late shifts that paid an additional $3 per hour. Her coworkers thought she was saving for a new car or home repairs, and she let them think it. The dream was too tender to share, too vulnerable to the kind of casual skepticism people infer when they can't imagine your ambitions. Leilani opened a separate account at the First Hawaiian Bank branch near her apartment, one without a debit card, accessible only if she physically went to the branch. The inconvenience was the point. Each deposit became a small ceremony, a recommitment to the promise she'd made to Keone's memory and to the family they'd built together. Kalani had been supportive at first, in the distant way adult children are supportive of their parents' hobbies. "That's nice, Mom. Yeah, let us know when you get closer." But when she'd called him 6 months ago to say she'd finally saved enough, that she'd found a perfect week in April when the rates were lower and the weather ideal, his enthusiasm had seemed genuine. He'd even volunteered to help coordinate with his sisters, Nalani and Kiana, who lived on the mainland now, nurses in Seattle and Phoenix respectively. They'd been thrilled, already requesting time off from their hospitals. For a few golden weeks, Leilani had allowed herself to believe the dream was manifesting exactly as intended. The shift had been subtle. Pualani, Kalani's wife of 7 years, had started asking detailed questions about the accommodations. Were there enough bedrooms that she and Kalani could have privacy from all the chaos? Would there be a separate space for the kids to play so the adults could relax? Could they adjust the itinerary to include the restaurants she'd been researching, the ones that required reservations months in advance? Leilani had tried to accommodate every request, stretching her budget to include a large-air rental house, adding a deposit for a private cabana, even pre-booking babysitting services so the adults could have their grown-up time. "I just want everyone to be happy. That's what mothers do, right? W-E stretch until we're E translucent. Until everyone else is comfortable." Each accommodation had required sacrifices Leilani never mentioned. The cabana deposit meant she couldn't replace her 12-year-old refrigerator that hummed ominously through the night. The restaurant reservations meant she ate rice and canned tuna for 3 weeks straight. The LR Gier house meant she sold her grandmother's jade bracelet, the one piece of jewelry she'd promised herself she'd never part with. But she told herself these were investments in joy, in the kind of family cohesion that couldn't be bought but could be facilitated. She told herself that Pualani's demands came from a place of wanting everything to be perfect, not from a place of entitlement. She told herself lies we tell when the truth would require confrontations we're not ready to have. But what happens when your flexibility becomes someone else's expectation, when your sacrifices become their baseline assumption? How do you know when giving becomes enabling, when love becomes doormat? The text message had arrived on a Saturday morning exactly 9 days before departure. Leilani had been at the Salvation Army, dropping of bags of clothes she'd culled from her closet to make room for the new muumuu she'd splurged on for the trip, a rare indulgence in coral and cream that made her feel almost beautiful. Her phone had buzzed in her purse as she was thanking the volunteer, and she'd glanced at it with the casual expectation of a grocery reminder or weather update. Instead, Kalani's message had detonated her entire world with the emotional precision of someone who'd never considered the blast radius. She'd read it 3 times in the parking lot, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grip the phone. "Mom, Change of plans. Polanyi thinks it's better if this trip is just for our immediate family. You understand, right? Thanks for everything. No phone call, no preamble, no acknowledgement that he was uninviting his own mother from a trip she'd spent 3 years funding. The casual cruelty of, "You understand, right?" suggested he genuinely believed she would simply accept this. That maternal love was so unconditional, it included financing your own exclusion. The thanks for everything felt like the kind of thing you'd write in a farewell card to a coworker who was retiring, not to the woman who'd given you life and was now, apparently, being retired from yours. Leilani had driven home in a daze, her mind cycling through disbelief, grief, and then, surprisingly, a cold, clarifying fury. She'd always thought of herself as someone who processed emotions slowly, who needed time to understand her own reactions. But this anger was instant and pure, uncontaminated by self-doubt or the urge to excuse Kalani's behavior. She'd parked in her usual spot beneath the monkey pod tree and had sat there for 20 minutes, watching a myna bird hop along the sidewalk, and had realized something essential. She'd spent decades training her children to see her as endlessly resilient, endlessly accommodating, a resource that could be tapped without consequence. She'd taught them, through her own behavior, that she would always prioritize their comfort over her dignity. When she finally went inside, she didn't cry. Crying would have released the pressure, and she needed the pressure. She needed the clean, sharp edge of her rage to stay intact, because it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing into the kind of self-pity that would make her call Kalani and beg for inclusion. Instead, she made tea. The good kind, the oolong Keone had loved, and she sat at their small kitchen table and opened her laptop. The confirmation emails were all there, organized in a folder she'd labeled Keone's Dream. Every reservation, every prepaid experience, every carefully calculated expense that had required her to choose between her own needs and this collective joy she'd been building for others. Here's what Leilani understood in that moment that Kalani and Polanyi didn't. Money isn't just currency, it's permission. They'd assumed that once she'd given the money, she'd relinquished all claim to it, that her role was complete. But the reservations were in her name. The credit card authorizations required her confirmation. The rental car couldn't be picked up without her driver's license. They'd taken her generosity for granted without securing the actual infrastructure they needed. It was the kind of oversight that comes from never having been told no, from assuming that mothers exist in a state of perpetual agreement. Leilani clicked on the Halekulani Hotel confirmation and hovered her cursor over the Modify Reservation button. Is this who I want to be? The woman who strikes back? Or is this simply who I need to be to survive what they've done? But the question felt false even as she asked it, because sometimes survival and strength look exactly like consequences. By Sunday evening, Leilani had placed holds on every major reservation, not cancellations, which would have triggered immediate refunds and alerts, but temporary freezes that required her personal verification before services could be rendered. She'd called the hotel, explaining that there might be fraudulent activity on her account, and she needed to confirm any check-ins personally. She'd contacted the snorkeling company and the luau organizers with the same story. She'd even reached out to the car rental agency, placing a flag that required her physical ID at pickup. Each conversation had been polite, concerned, the tone of someone protecting herself from identity theft, rather than someone orchestrating a lesson in respect. The brilliance of her approach was its subtlety. If questioned, she had plausible deniability. She was simply being cautious with her finances, a reasonable stance for a woman in her late 60s living on a fixed income plus part-time work. But the practical effect was that Kalani and Polanyi's trip was now a house of cards balanced on her continued cooperation, and she had no intention of cooperating. She imagined them at the airport, confident and packed, only to discover at the hotel that their reservation was on hold, pending verification from a woman who wouldn't be answering her phone. The image brought her no joy. Revenge, she was discovering, was more bitter than satisfying, but it brought her something more valuable, a sense of restored agency. Monday morning, Leilani woke with unusual clarity. She made herself a proper breakfast: Portuguese sausage, scrambled eggs with green onions, rice, the kind of meal she usually reserved for guests. She ate slowly, tasting each bite, and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten without calculating the cost per serving or feeling guilty about the indulgence. As she washed her dishes, she thought about Keone's journal entry, about his wish to gather family. But what was family, really? Was it the people you shared blood with, or the people who treated you like you mattered beyond your utility? She thought about her book club friends, women she'd known for decades. She thought about her former co-workers, especially Rosa and Agnes. Widows like herself who'd become invisible in their own families after their husbands died. An idea began forming, audacious and healing in equal measure. The trip was already paid for, or would be once she unfroze the reservations. The dates were set, the arrangements made. The only variable was who would benefit from them. Why should Kalani and Pualani's betrayal mean that Keone's dream died? Why couldn't she honor his wish for family while redefining what family meant? She picked up her phone and started a group text to 5 women: Rosa, Agnes, June, Patricia, and Linda. Women who'd been set aside by their adult children, who'd become convenient babysitters but inconvenient dinner guests, who'd funded graduations and weddings and first homes, only to be fled to the margins of their own families' lives. The message was simple: I have a fully paid trip to the Big Island next week. Beachfront hotel, all meals, tours included. I was going to go with my son's family, but plans changed. I'm going anyway, and I'd love company. Are you free? The responses came within minutes. Shock, gratitude, disbelief, and then, from every single one of them, a resounding yes. As Leilani watched the messages pour in, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: anticipation. Not the anxious anticipation of hoping others would be pleased, but the pure, selfish anticipation of claiming joy for herself. Is it wrong to feel this excited about something born from pain? Or is this exactly what healing looks like? Refusing to let someone else's cruelty become your cage. She didn't have an answer, but for the first time in days, she didn't need one. Tuesday brought the first text from Kalani. Hey Mom, just confirming you got all the hotel confirmation numbers to us. Want to make sure we have everything squared away. The audacity was almost impressive. He was asking her to facilitate her own exclusion, to ensure that the trip she'd been uninvited from would proceed smoothly. Leilani stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. The old version of herself would have sent the confirmations immediately, perhaps with a cheerful note wishing them a wonderful time, absorbing the hurt privately like she'd been taught. The new version, the one who'd woken up Sunday morning and decided she was done being convenience, simply left him on read. By Wednesday, Pualani had entered the chat. Hi Leilani. Kalani said you haven't sent the hotel info yet. We're getting a little worried since we leave in less than a week. Can you forward everything today? The exclamation points felt aggressive, a forced cheerfulness that barely masked irritation. Leilani noticed the shift from Mom to Leilani, the subtle distancing that happened when people wanted something but didn't want to acknowledge the relationship that obligated them to ask nicely. She responded with strategic vagueness. Still sorting out some details with the reservations. We'll let you know. 3 hours later, Kalani called. She declined it. He called again. She declined again. The power dynamic was shifting, and she could feel them scrambling on the other end. Thursday afternoon, Leilani met the 5 women at her apartment to finalize their plans. They arrived with the tentative excitement of people who'd been disappointed so many times that joy felt like a trap. Rosa brought haupia, Agnes brought spam musubi, June brought a bottle of wine none of them would drink until afternoon. They sat in Leilani's small living room. These women in their 60s and 70s, trading stories of how they'd become peripheral in their children's lives. Patricia's daughter had moved to California and called twice a year. Linda's son had remarried, and the new wife had systematically excluded her from family gatherings. Agnes's grandchildren thought of her as the boring grandma, compared to their other grandmother who had money for elaborate gifts. As they talked, Leilani realized they were describing variations of the same abandonment. The slow fade of people who loved you but didn't prioritize you, who appreciated you but didn't include you, who took your sacrifices for granted until you became defined entirely by what you could provide, rather than who you were. "We are going to change that narrative," Leilani said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "For 1 week, we're going to be the priority. We're going to eat at nice restaurants and take photos and laugh too loud and take up space. We're going to remember what it feels like to matter." The women looked at her with something like reverence, and in that moment, Leilani understood that leadership sometimes means giving others permission to claim what they've been told they don't deserve. They divided up the rooms, planned their outfits, researched activities beyond what Leilani had already booked. June wanted to visit a coffee plantation. Agnes wanted to see the lava flows at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Patricia wanted to try paddleboarding, something she'd never had the courage to attempt. As they talked, the initial tentative energy transformed into genuine enthusiasm, the kind of planning joy that comes when you're building something for yourself rather than executing someone else's vision. Leilani showed them photos of the Halekulani, the beachfront suites, the infinity pool that seemed to merge with the ocean. "This is really happening," Rosa whispered, and Agnes laughed, and suddenly they were all laughing. That slightly hysterical laughter of people who'd been holding their breath for so long they'd forgotten they were suffocating. By the time they left, it was nearly dark, and Leilani's phone had accumulated 7 more messages from Kalani and 4 from Pualani, each more urgent than the last. She read them all, felt nothing, and went to bed early. When did I become someone who could ignore my child's distress? Or have I just become someone who stopped prioritizing everyone else's manufactured emergencies over my own actual pain? Sleep came easily, dreamless and deep. The sleep of someone who'd finally stopped running from a confrontation she'd been avoiding for years. Friday morning, 3 days before departure, Kalani showed up at her apartment unannounced. Leilani was making coffee when she heard the knock, and she knew immediately who it would be. She'd wondered when he'd escalate from texts to an in-person visit, when he'd realize that his usual methods of managing her weren't working. She opened the door to find him standing there with his practiced smile, the one he used on difficult customers at the telecommunications company where he worked in sales. "Hey, Mom. Thought I'd stop by on my way to work." It was 6:47 a.m. His work didn't start until 9. The lie was lazy, which somehow made it worse. She let him in, poured him coffee he didn't drink, and waited. Kalani settled on her couch, the same couch he'd napped on as a teenager, and tried small talk about the weather and traffic. Leilani simply watched him, her face neutral, until he finally got to the point. "So, the hotel confirmations. We've been trying to reach you all week. Is everything okay with the reservations?" His tone suggested she might have simply forgotten, as if forgetting was the kind of mistake elderly mothers made with important information. "The reservations are fine," she said evenly. "I've just decided to use them myself." The silence that followed was profound, the sound of someone's assumptions shattering in real time. "What do you mean, use them yourself?" Kalani's practiced smile had vanished, replaced by confusion that was rapidly curdling into anger. "We're supposed to leave Tuesday. Pualani's already taken the time of F. The kids are packed. We've been planning this for months." Leilani took a sip of her coffee, letting him hear his own words. The casual erasure of her 3 years of sacrifice condensed into months of planning he'd done. "You were planning it," she corrected gently. "I was funding it." and I've decided to fund a different trip instead." She watched him process this, saw the moment he realized she wasn't confused or forgetful, but entirely deliberate. "Because of what I said last week?" He was trying for incredulous, but it came out defensive. "Mom, that was Puolani's idea. She just thought it would be less stressful if—" Leilani held up her hand, stopping him. "I don't need to hear Puolani's reasoning. I need you to hear something. For 3 years, I worked extra hours and skipped meals and sold my grandmother's bracelet so I could give this family a gift. Your father's dying wish was to gather everyone together, and I've been trying to honor that. And you, my son, the boy I raised alone after your father got sick, you sent me a text message uninviting me from my own gift." Her voice didn't rise, but Kalani flinched as if she'd shouted, "I'm taking 5 of my friends to the Big Island instead," she continued. "Omen whose families have forgotten them. We're going to have a wonderful time, and we're going to honor your father's memory by remembering what family actually means. Not blood, but respect. Not obligation, but choice." Kalani stood, his face red, cycling through arguments he couldn't quite articulate. "Why, you can't just change everything last minute. What are we supposed to tell Puolani? The kids?" Leilani walked to her door and opened it. "Tell them Grandma decided she deserved to be valued, not used. Tell them anything you want, but tell them quickly, because I'm leaving Tuesday morning and I won't be answering my phone." She watched him leave, his confusion hardening into something uglier, and felt no urge to comfort him. Is this what boundaries feel like? This strange mix of relief and guilt? Of freedom and loss? Or is this just what standing up feels like when you've been sitting down for decades? Saturday and Sunday passed in a flurry of packing and final preparations. Leilani's phone rang constantly. Kalani, Puolani, even Kalani's sisters Nalani and Kiana calling from the mainland, confused about what was happening. She answered Nalani and Kiana, explaining the situation calmly, and was surprised by their responses. "Good for you, Mom," Nalani had said. "Kalani told us you were fine not going. We thought it was weird, but he made it sound like your idea." Kiana was more blunt. "Puolani's been trying to edge you out for years. I'm glad you finally pushed back." Their support was validating but also painful. They'd seen what was happening and hadn't intervened. A passive acceptance that felt like its own small betrayal. Monday afternoon, the day before departure, Puolani showed up at Leilani's apartment. Unlike Kalani's surprise visit, this one felt calculated, timed for when Kalani would be at work and unable to interfere with whatever approach Puolani had planned. She arrived with Leilani's grandchildren, 8-year-old Koa and 5-year-old Liko, who ran to hug her with the uncomplicated affection of children who don't yet understand adult conflicts. "Tiutu, are you coming to the beach with us?" Koa asked, using the Hawaiian term for grandmother. Leilani knelt to hug them, her heart aching, and looked up at Puolani, who was watching with an expression that managed to be both defiant and calculating. "Actually, kids, Tutu's going on her own special trip," Puolani said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "She decided she'd rather go without us." The manipulation was blatant, weaponizing the children's disappointment, making Leilani the villain. Liko's lower lip trembled. "You don't want to come swimming with us?" Leilani stood, her resolve hardening. "I would have loved to come swimming with you," she said, looking at Puolani. "But your mom decided I shouldn't." She turned back to the children. "So I'm taking my friends instead. But when I get back, I'll show you all my pictures, and maybe we can plan a special day together. Just the 3 of us." After Puolani left, unsuccessful in whatever emotional manipulation she'd hoped to achieve, Leilani sat on her lanai, watching the sun set over the Pacific. The reality of what she'd done was settling in, not as doubt but as consequence. She'd drawn a line, and there would be fallout. Kalani might not forgive her for months or longer. The grandchildren would be confused. Family gatherings would be awkward. But as she sat there, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple, she realized something fundamental. She'd spent so much of her life trying to keep everyone else comfortable that she'd forgotten comfort was something she deserved too. The phone rang one more time, Kalani, predictably. And this time she answered. "Mom, please, we can figure this out. Maybe you can join us for part of the trip. Maybe we can..." His voice was desperate now, stripped of entitlement, and part of her wanted to relent. But the Largear part, the part that had survived Keone's death and years of being taken for granted, knew that relenting now would teach him nothing. "Kalani, I love you. I always will. But I'm done being treated like I only matter when I'm useful. I'm going on this trip. You should have figured out your situation days ago. I'm sorry you're scrambling, but that's not my emergency to fix anymore." She hung up before he could respond, before his voice could erode her resolve. When did the need to be loved become more important than the need to be respected? And why did it take me 70 years to understand they should be the same thing? Tuesday morning arrived bright and clear. One of those perfect Hawaiian mornings where the air tastes like salt and plumeria. Leilani met the other women at the airport. Rosa, Agnes, June, Patricia, and Linda, all dressed in their traveling best, carrying luggage that was probably packed and repacked a dozen times in nervous anticipation. They huddled together at the gate like teenagers on a class trip, giddy and slightly disbelieving that this was actually happening. The flight to Kona was short, less than an hour, but it felt ceremonial, a literal elevation from their ordinary lives into something unprecedented and entirely their own. When they arrived at the Halekulani Resort in Kona, the staff treated them like dignitaries. The rooms Leilani had booked were even more beautiful than the photos. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, private lanais with cushioned furniture, bathrooms larger than some of their living rooms. They gathered in Leilani's suite, which connected to Rosa's, and stood silently for a moment, taking in the luxury that felt almost illicit. "We deserve this," Agnes finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "We've earned this." And suddenly they were crying and laughing simultaneously. That cathartic release of tension that comes when you finally stop apologizing for taking up space. That first afternoon, they did nothing productive. No tours, no activities, just the radical act of existing without obligation. They floated in the infinity pool, ordered drinks with umbrellas, took photos that made them look like women on a magazine cover, rather than women their families had sidelined. When a young couple asked them to take their photo, June suggested they all be in it together, and the resulting picture became the trip's defining image. 6 women, arms around each other, the Pacific stretching endlessly behind them, all of them laughing with the unself-conscious joy of people who'd finally given themselves permission to matter. Dinner that night was at the hotel's signature restaurant, the one Pualani had requested Leilani book, but that Leilani had never imagined she'd actually experience herself. They ordered lavishly, ahi poke, macadamia-crusted mahi-mahi, lobster tails, passion fruit cheesecake, and when the bill came, Leilani paid it without wincing, without calculating how many shifts it represented. She'd already done the math. This entire trip was costing less than what she'd originally budgeted for Kalani's family, because she'd negotiated for fewer rooms and hadn't included the expensive private experiences Pualani had demanded, which meant she had money left over, a cushion that felt like breathing room. Over dessert, Patricia asked the question they'd all been thinking. "Do you feel guilty about Kalani and Pualani?" Leilani considered this honestly. "Sometimes, when I think about the grandchildren, but then I remember that Kalani taught them it was acceptable to exclude me, and I realize that letting him get away with that would have taught them something worse. That love means accepting mistreatment, that elders exist to be useful and then discarded. By standing up for myself, I'm teaching them that every person has a breaking point, and that there are consequences for taking people for granted." Rosa raised her glass. "T.O. consequences," she said. They all raised theirs. TO consequences. Is this what Fr Edom tastes like? Sweet and bitter together. Like medicine that's finally curing an infection you've been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't normal? The week unfolded like a story they'd tell themselves for the rest of their lives. They snorkeled at Kealakekwa Bay, where Linda saw a sea turtle and cried at the beauty of it. They toured a coffee plantation where June learned she had a palate for single-origin beans and bought 20 pounds to take home. They visited Hawaii Volcanoes National Park at sunset, watching the glow of Kilauea's crater paint the sky in reds and oranges that seemed almost impossible. At each stop, they were mistaken for a formal group, a sisterhood, a church group, a women's club, and they never corrected anyone. They were all of those things and none of them. They were simply women who'd found each other at the exact moment they needed to be found. One afternoon, while the others were at the pool, Leilani took a walk along the beach alone. Her phone had been mostly silent since Tuesday. Kalani had stopped calling after the third day. But that afternoon, Nalani had texted photos from Seattle. Heard about your trip. You look happier than I've seen you in years. I'm sorry we didn't say something sooner. The apology was appreciated but insufficient, the kind of after-the-fact support that doesn't change the original injury. Still, it was something, more than Kalani had of Farid. She wondered where he was now, what story he'd told Polani, whether they'd managed to salvage any kind of vacation or had simply stayed home, stewing in the consequences of their own entitlement. She thought about texting him, reaching out first, rebuilding the bridge he'd burned. But then she remembered Keone's journal, his wish for family, and she realized she'd fulfilled it after all, just not with the people he'd meant. Family wasn't automatic, it was earned. It was Rosa sending her funny articles at 2 a.m. because insomnia made everything hilarious. It was Agnes learning her coffee order without being told. It was June, Patricia, and Linda showing up to her apartment with wine and spam musubi when she'd mentioned feeling lonely. These women had become her chosen family, and perhaps that was a more honest version of Keone's dream than gathering people obligated by blood to pretend they wanted to be together. On their last night, they gathered on Leilani's lanai to watch the sunset, passing around a bottle of wine and reflecting on the week. I don't want to go back, Linda said quietly. I don't want to return to being invisible. Patricia reached over and squeezed her hand. Then don't. We know now what it feels like to be visible, to be prioritized. We can't let them take that away from us again. They made a pact that night, these 6 women. They would meet monthly, would plan another trip next year, would stop accepting crumbs from tables they'd helped build. More importantly, they would stop measuring their worth by how useful they were to others and start measuring it by how truthful they were to themselves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the ocean into liquid gold, Leilani felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly, but peace. She'd lost something in standing up to Kalani. That was undeniable. But she'd found something too, something more durable than the illusion of family unity built on her endless accommodation. She'd found her own voice, her own agency, her own definition of what love should look like when it's reciprocated rather than extracted. The question wasn't whether she'd done the right thing, it was whether she'd ever find the courage to keep doing it. And what happens when you finally teach people that you have limits? Do they learn to respect the boundaries, or do they simply find someone else who hasn't discovered theirs yet? 3 weeks after returning from the Big Island, Leilani received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter on stationery she recognized from Kalani's home of Feis. She made herself tea before opening it, preparing for either an apology or an attack, uncertain which would be harder to receive. The letter was neither. It was something more complicated, an accounting. Kalani had written out every expense she'd ever covered for him. The down payment on his first car, the security deposit on his first apartment, the emergency loan when Pualani had been between jobs, the money for Koa's preschool when their budget was tight. He'd tallied it all, added interest, and included a check for the full amount plus 20%. "I don't know if this is what you want," the letter read. "But Puolani says this is how we settle things now. If everything is transactional, then here's the transaction completed. I hope it helps you plan your next trip with your new family." The bitterness was palpable even through paper, and Leilani sat with the check for a long time, understanding what it represented. It was Kalani's way of severing obligation, of reducing their relationship to a ledger that could be balanced and closed. It was also his way of protecting himself from the guilt of what he'd done by reframing her generosity as a loan that was now repaid. The cruelty was in the reduction. The idea that 3 years of sacrifice could be reconciled with a single payment, as if love operated on the same principles as debt. She didn't cash the check. Instead, she framed it and hung it in her apartment, a reminder that some people will never understand the difference between supporting someone and being exploited by them. She wrote Kalani a letter in return, one she revised 17 times before settling on 3 paragraphs. She told him she didn't want his money. She told him she wanted him to understand that respect and love were not negotiable, that she would always be his mother but would no longer be his convenience. She told him the door was open whenever he was ready to have a relationship built on mutual dignity rather than unilateral sacrifice. She sent it with no expectation of response, and none came. At least not immediately. But life has a way of continuing despite our broken relationships, of insisting we find meaning even in the wreckage of what we'd hoped would last forever. Leilani returned to her work at Ala Moana, but she negotiated for better hours and stopped taking every extra shift of Fared. She used the money she'd been saving for the next family reunion to take a ceramics class at the community center, something Keone had always encouraged her to try. She was terrible at it. Her bowls were lopsided, her vases leaked, but she loved it anyway, loved the feeling of creating something imperfect and claiming it as hers. Rosa, Agnes, June, Patricia, and Linda became constants in her life, a chosen family that showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning, Leilani opened her door to find Koa and Liko standing there with Kalani behind them, all 3 looking uncertain. "Tiutu," Koa said hesitantly. "Dad says we didn't understand before. About the trip, about how you felt." She looked at Kalani over their heads, saw something in his face that might have been humility or might just have been exhaustion, and made a decision that would have been impossible a year earlier. She invited them in, not because she'd forgiven completely, not because everything was resolved, but because she'd learned that boundaries and love could coexist, that standing your ground didn't mean building walls so high that reconciliation became impossible. They sat in her small living room, and for the first time in years, Kalani listened without defending, heard without dismissing, and apologized without caveats. The relationship they rebuilt wasn't the same as what they'd had before. It was smaller, more honest, more careful. Kalani and Puolani were never invited on the annual trips Leilani now took with her chosen sisters, though the grandchildren sometimes came along, learning from their grandmother what it meant to prioritize people who prioritized you back. Nalani and Kiana visited more often, making amends for their silence in their own ways. And Leilani continued working at the shopping center, continued taking her ceramics class, continued building a life that centered her own joy rather than everyone else's comfort. She never did cash Kalani's check. It stayed on her wall, a reminder that some lessons are expensive and some are priceless, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference. So here's the question for you. Wherever you are, whatever family you're navigating, when was the last time you checked whether your love was being reciprocated or just extracted? When was the last time you asked yourself if your flexibility had become someone else's expectation? And more importantly, what are you going to do about it? Because here's what Leilani learned on that beach in Kona, surrounded by women who'd also been set aside. You can't control whether people value you, but you can control whether you accept being devalued. You can't force respect, but you can refuse disrespect. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for those who take you for granted, is to stop making it easy for them to forget you matter. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships or your own boundaries, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel. Enable notifications for more stories about the quiet revolutions happening in ordinary lives. Leave a comment about a time you had to choose between being accommodating and being valued. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Your support helps me continue bringing these tales to light. And if you truly enjoyed this story and want to support this work, please buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest contribution makes a real difference, so stories like this can keep being told.